The year was 1666, and the city of London was a powder keg wrapped in timber and tar, waiting for fate's cruel hand to strike a match, and it came not with a roar, but with a whisper. The faint crackle of an oven in a modest bakery on Pudding Lane, where flames licked quietly at kindling, unnoticed, while the night was heavy with a restless wind that seemed to breathe with unnatural hunger, carrying sparks like embers of doom, slipping through alleys and catching the edges of wooden beams that had held the lives of families for generations. And as you step into that moment in your imagination, the darkness around you is pierced by a glow that should have been harmless. Yet behind it lies a question that has haunted centuries. Was this accident, negligence, or divine design? Because when the first roof collapses and the fire leaps across the lane, you realise you're no longer witnessing a simple blaze but the opening act of an inferno that would reduce a kingdom's proud capital to smouldering ruin. And every scream rising into the smoky sky carries the fear that the world is ending, while merchants clutch at their goods, mothers shield their children, and watchmen ring bells that no longer warn of thieves but of a fire that cannot be contained. And here, in this furnace of destiny, you feel the paradox of terror and awe. For London's destruction is at once horrifying and strangely inevitable, as though the city itself had been built for this night, every beam and shingle waiting to be consumed, every alleyway channeling the flames like rivers of heat, and as the smoke curls around St. Paul's spire in the distance, you're drawn into a mystery deeper than burning wood, because the fire seems to know where to go, what to claim, moving with intelligence, striking with purpose, and while panic spreads faster than the fire itself, you cannot help but wonder if you're witnessing not just a tragedy, but a turning point, the moment when a medieval city of wood is destroyed to give way to something new, something forged in stone and ash. And so the question lingers in the smoke. Was the Great Fire of London the cruelest accident of fate, or the destiny of an empire reshaped by flame? And as the first night draws its curtain of smoke across the stars, the city you knew is already gone, consumed by a force that neither king nor commoner could halt, leaving you with the chilling truth that London's inferno has only just begun. By dawn you begin to see why the flames found you so easily. Because medieval London was a city built for fire, a maze of timber houses leaning into each other like gossiping neighbours, their upper stories kissing across alleys so narrow that a person could stretch out a hand and touch the opposite wall, and every beam was dried by seasons of smoke, every roof dressed in tar, pitch and thatch, a wardrobe of kindling waiting for the slightest spark. Shop fronts spilled barrels of oil, tallow and spirits into the street. Chandlers hung ropes of wax like golden vines, and smithies exhaled hot breath from open forges, so that the whole marketplace hummed like a hearth. Long before the baker's oven whispered its fatal secret on Pudding Lane, the wind turned those cramped lanes into bellows, and you felt it in your lungs, a racing pull that fed the blaze as if the city itself inhaled and exhaled fire, carrying cinders under doors and through keyholes, threading them up stairwells and across wooden galleries where laundry fluttered like surrender flags. Builders had stacked lives above workshops, sleeping rooms over cellars of coal and resin, libraries over warehouses of spice and hemp, and when one ember landed, a household became a torch, then a street, then a parish, until London's map looked less like a plan and more like a fuse. Water could not reach what ladders could not find, for the lanes twisted unpredictably, and the river, the city's proud mirror, was lined with warehouses stuffed with grain, timber and sugar, cargo that burned hot and long. Guild rules favoured speed and familiar habit over caution, so timber kept rising, close and cosy, while royal proclamations against thatch and jetted fronts gathered dust, like prayers no one believed would be needed. In the churches, bells once rung for market days now tolled for passing roof lines. In the counting houses, ledgers tracked fortunes built on flammable trade. In the alehouses, patrons drank beneath rafters seasoned by candle soot. You taste resin on your tongue and realise the bitter truth. London had armoured itself not in stone but in wood, lacquered with enterprise, sealed with convenience, and stitched together by streets that turned wind into a weapon. When talk later spoke of foreign hands or dark intent, the wreckage told a plainer story, that a city is the sum of its choices, and this city had chosen proximity, profit and speed, weaving a tinder tapestry. The fire did not invent catastrophe, it merely read the blueprint and obeyed. In this fragile design you hear the lesson that later lawmakers and architects would inscribe upon the reborn city. Widen the streets, build in stone and brick, clear the overhangs, separate hearth from shop, place stores of fuel away from homes, and let water flow freely, because London history had proved that beauty without prudence becomes peril, and that a capital of trade must be a capital of safety before prosperity can endure again. Night folds over medieval London as smoke thickens, and fear braids itself with wind, turning whispers into warnings while rooftops glow like horizons. Pudding Lane. You move with the crowd, a human tide carrying bedding, ledgers, cradles, while cinders skate the alleys, pricking skin, stinging eyes, guiding panic like herders. A watchman swings his bell until arm tendons burn, but sound drowns under the crackle, the city's new language, a grammar of embers writing destinies. In Milk Street, a mother knots shawls. Around children, then sees sparks nibble the lintel, and she walks, not runs, because dignity holds terror steady. By the river, boatmen bargain with flame-coloured reflections, loading trunks, cages and hopes, while warehouses grumble, their bellies packed with timber, sugar and grain. You catch the taste of resin and ash, a bitter communion telling you the city prepared this banquet, long before the baker's hearth whispered tonight. Roofs kiss across lanes, passing flame like gossip, while windows belch heat, and laundry ascends skyward as burning pennants, mapping routes the wind hungrily repeats. At the cathedral, caretakers watch distant orange climb the hill, wondering whether stone can pray itself cool, whether lead roofs will sink like heavy rain. Merchants drag coffers into carts, counting futures by touch, while apprentices haul buckets that empty like teaspoons against a sea, each splash swallowed immediately whole. The wind arrives in gusts, a bellows from the east, and doorways breathe sparks. Thresholds brighten, roofs sigh, and streets become ropes of heat tonight. You hear livestock low from courtyards, dogs whine behind shutters, and churchyards fill with bundles, names stitched to cloth, because identification now lives in thread. Some neighbours form lines, passing leather buckets from well to fire, but the water turns steam mid-air, and discipline frays as roofs begin splintering apart. A bookseller hesitates, fingers stroking spines, then chooses family letters over priceless editions, proof that love measures wealth differently when pages and hearths meet flame. Along Cheapside, market stalls bloom like comets, and spices perfume the air with tragic sweetness, cinnamon and clove masking panic as people move obediently onward. Rumour travels faster than flame, whispers name strangers, accuse rivals, distrust distances, yet evidence shouts otherwise that materials and wind, not malice, command night. You remember the morning's lecture about jetted houses and tarred walls, and the lesson stalks you through alleys, repeating sternly that design decides destiny tonight. When a parish pump fails, men reach for hooks and axes, trying to tear gaps the fire cannot cross, but every breach becomes a mouth. The sky ripens from copper to blackened plum, and stars vanish behind sheets of smoke, while the river gathers fugitives cradling silence broken by sobbing. You set down what cannot be carried forever, a keepsake, a crust, a lock of hair, because breath matters and footsteps must remain available tonight. Behind you the district buckles and flares. Ahead the hill smoulders, and between poles of ruin stretches a path where destiny walks, unblinking beside you. Morning arrives with a blast of heated breath, and the city answers like a kiln flung open, for the Inferno has broken its tether and now moves with a terrible will, hunting along timbers, sucking air through every keyhole, thundering through lofts where grain explodes, into glowing dust that dances upward like possessed snow. You hear rafters shriek as resin boils inside them, beams flexing before they shatter, and each collapse releases a storm of sparks that lands 2 streets away, so that distance no longer means safety, only delay. Firehooks rip at eaves, men cough behind wet cloths, and buckets climb along human ladders until the water vanishes into steam, leaving palms blistered and hearts stuttering, because this is not a blaze at a single address, but a creature spanning parishes, a red river that runs wherever the wind points its finger. Along the riverfront, warehouses pop like overripe fruit, sugar oozing into caramel rivers, barrels of oil bursting into bright fans that paint the water with slick colour, while boatmen shove off overloaded, their poles biting into reflected flame. The river itself a wavering mirror that seems to burn without burning. In the markets, spices erupt into perfumed storms, and the air tastes of cinnamon grief, clove regret, pepper panic, as stalls fly apart like kindling, and ribbons of cloth ignite in flowing banners that tug at the sky. The wind that haunted the night becomes a general by morning, marshalling gusts through alleys and across courtyards, swirling fire to leap streets as easily as a cat crosses a wall, until the blaze advances in flanking motions, surrounding squares, probing weak points, then surging with a roar that scrapes your ribs from the inside. Bells try to talk above the thunder, but metal runs in shining tears from steeples, and gutters flow with a new river made of lead, while panes explode into glittering dust that pricks the skin like icy rain, even as the heat claws your lungs. Neighbours who argued yesterday share cordage and bread today, while apprentices shoulder poles and matrons gather children with names stitched to sleeves, a small defiance against forgetting. Somewhere a chest is dragged to safety, then abandoned for a cradle, because all reckonings become simple when roofs collapse, and the street itself glows at the seams, stones sweating, nails writhing in doorframes like living thorns. The city groans like a ship in a storm, and you feel that ship turning, timbers cracking, future unmoored, as the old plan of wooden intimacy surrenders to an elemental verdict. Rumours skim the smoke, naming strangers and plots, yet every alley repeats the same lesson, that design, wind, and fuel have formed an alliance stronger than malice, and the lesson carves itself into memory with letters of flame. You step with the tide of bodies toward higher ground, and glimpse the hill where the great cathedral waits like a sentinel carved from dawn, its ancient bones encircled by embers, its towers barely visible behind a veil of shimmering heat, and you wonder whether stone can pray loudly enough to hold back a sky on fire, for the blaze has become a language now, and it is writing the city into ash. On Ludgate Hill the great cathedral loomed through a river of heat, its ancient nave a fortress of prayer and parchment, yet even stone began to breathe like a kiln as the Inferno pressed upward from the markets and lanes below, and you felt that climb in your chest, a slow tightening. Booksellers had stacked rescued volumes within the cloister and along the churchyard, believing those holy walls would shield ink from cinder, but the wind drove sparks beneath doors and along scaffolds, and parchment that had survived wars and rain surrendered to a hiss that sounded like pages whispering. Lead upon the roof softened, then ran in shining streams through gargoyle mouths, falling as bright tears that spattered the paving, and the timbers hidden above the vault cracked, exhaling resinous breath. Suddenly a bell gave a strangled note, metal sagging as if exhausted by prayer that could not cool the sky. Inside, caretakers moved relics towards side chapels, and a sexton traced a cross upon soot, then coughed until breath vanished. You watched dust drift like snow within the nave, each mote a glowing fleck, and the great pillars seemed to waver, not from doubt, but from heat that bends the air itself. Outside, tradesmen strained at firehooks to tear a break, yet the gale funneled along the hill and wrapped the transepts, and when a warehouse nearby erupted, the breath of that blast slapped the west front, blowing open doors so that flame entered like a choir arriving late, fierce and uninvited. The organ pipes warbled, then blistered, the choir stalls smouldered, and above, the wooden roof groaned like a ship, ribs opening, until a section gave way with a sound that seemed to fold the century, and a gust hurled sparks the length of the nave, crowning statues with brief and burning coronets. People who had carried books to safety now carried one another, guiding elders along aisles while the pavement spat heat through the soles of their shoes, and every step echoed like a farewell. Then the tower's frame shuddered, a single long groan, and the roof above the crossing lifted as if inhaling. What followed felt less like collapse than revelation, for the vault burst and a pillar crashed, sending a rolling cloud through the nave that smothered sound, and when it cleared you saw sky where once there had been painted stars, the open mouth of ruin speaking a language that even kings would learn. Lead pooled in molten mirrors around fallen stones, reflecting a city still burning up hill and down, while manuscripts curled into black petals that lifted, swirled, and vanished, and among the drifting leaves of ash a child reached for a charred scrap, holding it like a relic from a vanished world of learning. From that wound the city would study its own design, grieving, taking measure, and the river below waited with boats while smoke bent like veils, calling people downhill toward water, toward reflection, toward the river of ash. Down the slope toward the Thames you move with thousands, a wavering procession of soot, streaked families, apprentices, and elders, while the river receives them like a long mirror, rippling with orange and copper, its surface freckled by ash, falling gently as phantom snow from the wounded hill atop it. Boatmen shout prices, then swallow pride when faced with weeping children, hauling trunks, cages and quilts aboard skiffs that sit low, while heavier barges take parish chests and guild ledgers. Proof that even in calamity London clings to memory, to trade, to identity stitched into parchment kept against drifting loss. Along the wharf, barrels pop and tumble, leaking sweetness that hisses on cobbles, while rope coils smoulder like sleeping serpents, and coopered casks burst into hoops, each ring skittering away like frightened fish. So the quay becomes a percussion of heat, clangour, and desperate footfalls seeking passage through stinging smoke. You smell cinnamon grief and pepper panic as spice stores light like constellations fallen to earth, their glitter replaced by sparks, and the air turns thick as wool, sending coughs through the crowd. Yet the river opens lanes of breath, offering escape routes where streets have become furnaces for many. A mother counts children by touch, one on her back, one clasping her skirt, another already aboard, and she steps onto a rocking skiff that smells of tar and hope, while behind her a neighbour passes a cradle forward, arms forming bridges the flames cannot easily sever in shared resolve. Ferries glide past floating letters, singed pages from the cathedral libraries turning to black petals that kiss the tide, and a boy snatches one, reading half a psalm before it dissolves, learning in a single breath how knowledge travels, survives and vanishes, like breath upon winter glass under burning skies. From the south bank you watch London glow like a brazier, roofs collapsing inward with sighs that carry across water, while bells that once organised markets now fall silent, their molten tears pooling beside shattered stones, and the city seems to exhale, as though surrendering an exhausted century into twilight. Yet even refuge breeds rumour, for along the crowded decks tongues sharpen, naming foreigners, muttering about plots, and a frightened shout becomes a shove until a sheriff's voice steadies the rail, reminding all that wind and wood are culprits here, and that panic multiplies needless sorrow across this trembling harbour. Night drops again, and the river turns to ink, reflecting only the crawling red along the shore, and oars dip like metronomes, keeping time with hearts that have lost houses, while pilots study eddies by feel, guiding convoys to meadows and fields where tents blossom like moonlit gardens for survivors. By morning the current carries grey silt and char, a river of ash that stains palms, hems and memories, and you understand that the Thames has become London's diary, washing away sentences even as it writes new ones, promising that beyond this crossing the story will continue with harder lessons. By midday the fields of refuge murmured like hives, and the whispers had teeth. Names floated across blankets and cooking pots, pointing not at wind or timber but at strangers. You heard talk of foreign hands, secret marks, vials of oil, sparks tossed from unseen rooftops, each rumour brighter than proof. A frightened mason swore he saw a map in the ashes, streets traced like targets. A brewer insisted the fire leaped only where enemies lived. Fear turned voices into blades, and a shove at the key became an accusation by the tents. Officials moved through the encampments with measured steps, taking statements, calming quarrels, promising inquiry, yet their ledgers could not compete with campfire tales. You watched suspicion leap like ember to cloth, catching on accents, clothes and trades, because ruin asks for a human face. A journeyman from distant shores hid his tools beneath his cloak. A widow clutched a rosary as if it were a passport. Children copied their elders, drawing villains in the soot, while the river carried fragments of rumour downstream like dark petals. Yet when you lifted your eyes, you saw the same truth the blaze had shouted since the first night. Wind, wood, pitch, and narrow lanes were accomplices enough. Still the whispers multiplied, because grief bargains, and anger seeks purchase, where engineering and chance feel too cold to blame. A sheriff posted notices warning against violence, but a crowd gathered anyway outside a riverside warehouse, demanding an arrest for a crime they could not name. You stepped in, voice raw from smoke, and asked what evidence would satisfy them. Silence wavered, then someone pointed at the sky where embers drifted like omen. That was the logic of the hour. The heavens accused, the ashes testified, and the guilty could be anyone who didn't belong. Later magistrates will write that fear ran ahead of fact, and royal proclamations will urge restraint. Yet tonight the city breathes through rumour. Around scattered fires, survivors recite small oaths to one another, promising watchfulness, promising to guard tents, sharing bread with wary eyes that keep returning to unfamiliar silhouettes. Somewhere a clerk copies names and testimonies into a soot-streaked book, knowing that lists will help the mourning separate grievance from guilt, architecture from malice. You lie awake under canvas and hear the wind rehearsing over the river, and you understand that the blaze needs no conspirator. Still, before sleep comes, a final murmur passes from tent to tent, saying perhaps there were signals, perhaps a hand guided the gusts, perhaps destiny wears a human mask. You store the question beside your rescued keepsakes, not because you believe it, but because uncertainty feels warmer than the night, and because meaning, like embers, travels easily. Come morning, officials will ride camp to camp with measured words and wary guards, urging patience, counting losses and reminding. All that rebuilding requires witnesses, not scapegoats, and stones, not stories, if London hopes to rise from ash by river and decree. From the terrace and from the river, the sovereign watched the great fire of London move like a red tide, and when the wind rose again he set aside ceremony, soot streaking his sleeves as he stepped among carpenters, soldiers, and parish wardens, speaking in a steady voice that carried across the din, ordering fire breaks, ordering houses pulled down before the flames could devour entire parishes. You stood near enough to see the hesitation on faces that measured a lifetime against a wall, and then the royal command cut through doubt, and iron hooks bit timber, while axes found the joints of eaves, and the city groaned as if consenting to surgery without sleep. Reports came by skiff from the navy offices, a clerk breathless with news that lanes had become chimneys, and that water failed wherever heat took the air first, and the king listened with eyes on the glow crawling toward the hill where the ruined cathedral smoked like an altar, then nodded to his brother who rode at the line, guiding teams that laid powder and drew wicks with trembling competence. The first demolition startled even the bold, a clap of wind and dust, a gap suddenly carved where a row had stood since childhood, and for one heartbeat the fire paused as if blinking, then lunged again and the lesson sharpened. Only absence could arrest it. Only stone or space could deny this appetite. The king moved from knot to knot of labour, promising recompense for losses, calling by title and trade, each word a ledger entry written in soot and breath. You heard him ask for ladders, for wet blankets, for courage, and courage answered in scores, a tide of ordinary hands now working under royal gaze. Across the river the fields of refuge lifted a murmur when word spread that the crown was at the front, and even those who distrusted courts found their fear steadied by the sight of command-sharing smoke. Night pressed down and torches marked the new ruptures, black teeth bitten from the city's mouth, and along those jagged edges the fire snarled, confused by space that could not burn, while squads carried more powder, set more fuses, and stepped back with prayers quick and private. In those hours you understood how leadership becomes a kind of architecture, an invisible scaffolding that holds a collapsing world long enough for choices to live, and you felt the city lean into it, exhausted yet newly aligned. Rumour, which had hunted strangers the previous night, now pivoted toward purpose, whispering that the sovereign himself dragged a hook, that sleeves were scorched, that commands were given with a calm that asked citizens to match it, and many did, because the voice that names the danger also names the path through it. By dawn, a crooked line of emptiness faced the blaze like a shield of air, and though the fire found roots around and through, its certainty cracked, and London history bent toward survival under ash, decree, and the stubborn will of those who watched and worked beside their king. Guildhall stood like the city's stern heartbeat, stone ribs set above pavements worn by proclamations, processions and bargains, and as the Inferno pressed northward the great civic house inhaled smoke and memory together, the air inside tasting of parchment, beeswax and old authority, while outside sparks arrived like messengers bearing dreadful decrees that no alderman could overrule. Livery company banners had been hurried into carts, yet a few remained draped in the porch's shadow, colours dulled by soot, as clerks lifted ledgers that mapped the lifeblood of London trade, murmuring totals and names like prayers against erasure, until a gust scattered ash across the open folios, freckling ink with grey snow. The mayor's officers argued for demolition, for pulling flanking houses down to starve the flames, yet hesitation clung to the square, because the hall was more than walls. It was a stage on which the city imagined itself, and to harm that stage felt like tearing a page from the calendar of belonging. Wind does not wait for ceremony. It found scaffolding, found open joints, found the frail places where centuries had been patched, and it drove the fire along roofs until the lead flashed, ran, and dropped in glowing tears that dotted the stones. Inside, the carved giants who had watched trials and oaths seemed to lean through the shimmer, faces wavering as heat bent the air, and the oak principles above them creaked, stiff with age and resin, before issuing a sound like a sigh from a waking colossus. Buckets climbed and emptied, hooks bit, teams shouted time with a rhythm that made courage feel like carpentry. But when a neighbouring storehouse belched a cloud sparkling with embers, the hall shuddered in its foundations and the nave of civic life turned red. A clerk knelt to rescue a single charter, sealing wax softened, ribbon scorching his palm, and he walked it into daylight where the square opened like a throat swallowing smoke, then surrendered the document to a sheriff who wrapped it inside his coat as if cradling a newborn. The gallery timbers glowed, and dust fell like blessed salt, stinging eyes, whitening hair, and then the roof's hidden bones declared their verdict, a rolling crack that made every heart stumble, followed by a downward rush that filled the hall with a bloom of embers and a cavernous hush. When the cloud unrolled, pillars stood like battered survivors in a room newly roofed by sky, and pigeons, startled from niches, wheeled through heat before vanishing into light, leaving Londoners staring at the broken emblem of their order. In that silence, leadership felt suddenly homeless, and the crowd's breath turned uncertain, because when Guildhall bowed, the city's mirror tilted, and every trade saw itself without a frame. Yet from the edges, under the scorch and grit, a stubborn will assembled, constables forming lines, beadles guiding families, messengers racing to the royal teams, all agreeing that authority would move to the street, to the river stairs, to any patch of ground where instruction could be heard above the crackle. The fall did not end governance, it unmasked it, and you felt the lesson settle like ash upon your tongue, that a commonwealth lives in oaths, remembered and in hands joined, even when its proudest chamber has become a hearth for unwelcome stars. 4 days spread like burning calendar, each dawn brand upon memory, each night furnace lid, while London learned endurance by breathing smoke, counting heartbeats only. Sunday begins with ember rain, roofs sighing open, parishes failing like seams, and you walk uphill, then down, chasing rumours of safety that move faster. By midday, crews hack fire breaks, powder laid like punctuation, explosions carving pauses, the wind refuses, streets answer roaring back, a language of heat hunger relentless. Monday finds the river boxing the blaze, boats ferrying ledgers, infants, keepsakes, while warehouses burst, sugar running, oil blooming, and water wears a trembling crown. You hear bells melt into silence, see stones sweat, feel shoes blister through soles, and realize safety is movement, a pilgrimage measured by breath distance. Tuesday arrives with drifts like winter, camps swelling in fields, officials counting losses, while rumour circles, foreigners naming rivals, though timber and wind wrote script. Along fire lines sovereign names, streets, promises payment, steadies hands, powder chisels space, yet gusts reknit flames, vaulting lanes, skipping courtyards, until parishes blur into coastline. Beneath smoke calendar ticks, day into night, night into day, a metronome of crackle and collapse, you keep moving, because stopping invites heat claim names. By Wednesday morning, powder breaks bite, streets show gaps like missing teeth, and the blaze hesitates, then surges elsewhere, confused, meeting air will not burn. The map of ruin resembles shoreline, coves of cinder, headlands of rubble, and the river holds a flotilla of memory, boats with ledgers, tools, quilts. In Moorfields tents bloom like gardens, kitchens of charity flicker, and the city's poorest line up for broth, bread, a place to sleep without embers. You pass a scribe recording testimonies, soot fingerprinting margins, while constables warn against scapegoats, repeating lesson etched by flame, that materials and wind-shaped fate. Somewhere a midwife steadies breath under canvas, somewhere an old soldier sharpens a hook, because survival is discipline, and discipline is many small obediences repeated. At twilight sovereign rides line again, sleeves rhymed with soot, voice level, calling for powder here, ladders there, refusing panic, naming streets like family faithfully. by the fourth night the fire meets open ground and stone warehouses, snarling, probing, losing rhythm while human chains hold fast and the city discovers architecture. When dawn edges the smoke, a hush moves like tide, as if London listens for a heartbeat and hears breathing, weary, living, ready to reckon. These 4 days teach syllabus that planning is mercy, space is protection, stone is patience, and leadership is scaffold that holds while courage climbs upward. Not everything is saved, much is learned, and from learning rises resolve, a sketch of streets wider, safer, where wind will not conspire with timber. The city's heart keeps time with oars along the river, camps murmuring, bells silent, yet imagination drafts foundations as survivors share plans between sips broth. When smoke thins, you face map erased and rewritten. Understand 4 days of hell of forged turning, passage from timbered past to durable tomorrow together. Discover more untold disasters and hidden histories that shaped empires. Subscribe for cinematic deep dives into world history, legendary fires, forgotten plagues, lost civilizations, and mysteries that still haunt our past. Stay with us as we uncover how catastrophe, resilience, and destiny forged the modern world. Morning lifts a grey veil over London, and the cost of ashes becomes a ledger written on skin, breath, and ground. A reckoning that does not need quills or sums to be believed, because every street tells it aloud. Char where walls once laughed, silence where markets argued, empty thresholds holding the shape of families who fled the urban inferno that history will name the Great Fire of London. You walk through lanes where goods melted into memory, where iron curled like seaweed, where cobbles remember footsteps that will not return, and you feel how loss changes the weather of the heart. Here a tailor's shears lie fused shut, there a baker's peel is a blackened oar, and along the churchyard wall a line of scorched shoes points nowhere and everywhere at once. The famous tally will record that more than 13,000 homes fell, that near 90 parish churches were taken, that halls and wards collapsed until the map looked like coastline chewed by a relentless tide. Yet the truer arithmetic is in the camps where mothers count children by touch, in moorfields where pots of thin broth learn the names of streets that no longer exist. London history will remember the burning of St. Paul's Cathedral, but today you meet a bookseller who saved only a single letter from his father, and for him that page weighs more than a library. You meet a midwife who carried her ledger of births through smoke, because the city's breath is written in those names, because rebuilding London begins in keeping the story of London whole. Merchants, once rivalled by price and pride, share tarpaulins and tools, measuring wealth not by gold but by who still has hammer, rope, or a shoulder uninjured. Apprentices learn that labour is a language older than coin, passing buckets, lifting beams, tending embers so that small cook fires for the homeless do not wander wild. Relief wagons creak from estates and manors, bringing blankets and bread. Yet the queue remains longer than charity, and it is there you hear the lesson the fire wrote with heat. Planning is kindness, spacing is mercy, stone is memory's guardian. Officials move through ash with ledgers and careful voices, promising inquiry and compensation, taking affidavits that smell faintly of smoke, while surveyors pace out futures with cautious feet, imagining streets widened for wind to lose its teeth, imagining brick shoulders that will not splinter into kindling. In the dusk, choir fragments drift from tents as someone hums a psalm learned before the flame, and the tune stitches strangers into neighbours again, a gentle defiance that declares this is still London, even without roofs. You look back toward Pudding Lane and forward toward drawings that do not yet exist, and you understand the cost is not only what the fire consumed, but what must now be chosen with care. A safer city, a juster market, a memory worthy of the sorrow that bought it. In moorfields and across the open spaces where green once carried laughter, Hunger and displacement settled like an unwelcome army. Tents rising in crooked rows stitched from sails, blankets and scavenged cloth, each a fragile home against autumn's chill. You hear the city groan, not with fire now, but with empty stomachs, the sound of children crying for bread while mothers barter scraps of cheese for a ladle of broth, and fathers pace the edges of the camp, eyes searching for work where none exists. The great fire of London has ended, yet its echo is carved into the rumble of hunger that fills the night. Food wagons arrive from the countryside, pulled by oxen, whose flanks are dusty from long miles, and crowds gather before wheels stop, hands extended, words sharp with need. The thin stew inside cauldrons, never enough for the number of mouths waiting. The displaced sleep on straw that pricks their skin, wrapped in cloaks stiff with soot, while wind pulls at canvas and carries the scent of ruin from the city still smoking beyond the fields. In the markets that once thrived, only charred stalls remain, so coins mean little when there is nothing to buy, and survival is measured by who shares, who lends, who chooses compassion when scarcity bites hardest. Officials count names, record losses, and write orders for grain, but paperwork cannot fill bellies, and the people know it, their patience tested by every dawn that rises without promise. A boy drags a singed chest to his family's shelter, inside only a cracked bowl and a bent spoon, yet his mother kisses his head as if he had carried treasure, because in ruin even fragments mean continuity. Along the rows of tents, rumours move as quickly as hunger, of foreigners blamed, of plots imagined, of plague feared in the crowded air. But the greater truth is visible in every thin wrist and hollow cheek. Displacement has made Londoners strangers to their own city. Faith leaders walk among the shelters, offering prayer and blessing, yet their words are carried on the same wind that carries smoke, fragile, comforting, but intangible, against the ache in the gut. Still, small flames of resilience glow, women pooling flour to bake flatbread on iron sheets, children inventing games with stones, old men telling stories that weave memory into the night air, so the young know they belong to something more enduring than fire. Displacement is not just distance from walls, but from certainty, and as you watch the camps breathe in unison, you feel the weight of that exile, a city's heart beating outside its chest, waiting to return but not yet knowing how. Hunger scratches like a restless animal, but within that gnawing rises resolve, for London has lost roofs and streets, but it has not lost people, and it is in these fields of hardship that the next vision of the city will be born. In the smoky afterlight the political fallout began, not with a trumpet but with murmurs shaped into knives, and you felt how power and fear clasp hands when a city gropes for meaning after the great fire of London. Aldermen gathered beneath patched awnings, magistrates unrolled charred minutes, and courtiers weighed every phrase, while across the camps the rumour mill churned, naming foreigners, Catholics, secret agents, anyone whose accent or clothing could be paraded as a convenient answer to complicated truths of wind, timber, tar, and narrow lanes. Royal proclamation followed, urging restraint, forbidding vengeance, promising inquiry with sober language that tried to cool tempers as surely as crews had tried to cool rafters. Yet politics is a bellows, and each statement fed a different flame, with pamphleteers scratching quills into the night, pitting caution against outrage, London history against campfire gossip. You watched a council clerk take depositions that smelled of smoke, testimony braided with hearsay, while a sheriff escorted a trembling artisan through a hostile lane, his safety purchased by the visible weight of authority. You heard speeches at the river stairs where officials promised grain, compensation, and trials for any proven saboteurs, and you heard jeers that demanded culprits first and evidence later, because grief longs for a human mask it can seize, and conspiracy offers one more quickly than urban planning ever could. In the royal tents, advisers debated insurance charters and building codes, sentences about brick and stone that would remake streets. Yet even those prudent lines wore political colours in the telling, for some shouted that liberty lived in wood, while others answered that mercy lived in space and stone. Guild leaders jostled to protect privileges, parish officers defended boundaries, and behind every principle you could sense the granular struggle to preserve influence in a city whose map had become an argument written in ash. Preachers interpreted the Inferno as chastisement and renewal, and their words reached both factions, cooling a few tempers, hardening others, for sacred vocabulary can console and divide in the breath it takes to say destiny. Meanwhile, immigration fears spiked, and constables patrolled to keep camps from turning tribunals, repeating the royal phrase that justice must be public and patient. You carried petitions between tents and courts, your hands black with soot and ink, and you learned that administration is a theatre of posture and patience, where the honest work of measuring streets shares a stage with the louder work of assigning blame. Yet in quiet corners a wiser politics formed, as surveyors, masons and merchants met to sketch a safer London history in practical lines, making the case that rebuilding should be a social treaty, not merely a royal edict. When a printed confession from a desperate soul briefly set the city shrieking, cooler voices prevailed, reminding all that desperation breeds false stories and that science of materials, wind and alleys must be the true witness. Slowly the proclamation's cadence found purchase, and the city turned from hunting strangers to arguing standards, a necessary evolution from fear toward law that would anchor the rebuilding to come. Pickaxes rang against clinker and bone-coloured ash as the first survey crews combed the ruined wards, and you moved with them, learning how a city confides after catastrophe, because secrets beneath the rubble surface like breath after long silence. Here a cellar mouth opened on shelves of warped glass, where an apothecary once measured bitters and calm, the flasks now fused into translucent lilies, and there a shop floor revealed a pattern of scorched coins, a till exploded by heat. The metal flowered thin at the edges like petals that would cut a careful hand. In one courtyard, beneath a drift of charred beams, the crew uncovered a cache of manuscripts rolled tight inside a clay jar, pages smoky but legible, recipes for dyes and varnish, proof that knowledge travels in humble armour when palaces fail. In another, a baker's bricks held the ghost of loaves, hemispheres in the soot, a domestic calendar interrupted mid-week, reminding every onlooker that the great fire of London erased not abstractions but breakfasts, routines and small conversations about weather and price. Along a church wall the heat had blistered mortar into bubbles that burst at a touch, and within the nave fragments of coloured glass glimmered like a low constellation, sharp stars underfoot that once taught stories in sunlight. You crouched and traced a saint's surviving eye, then let it fall back to the dust, understanding that remembrance requires both keeping and release. Down by the river the frames of warehouses tilted like ribs of enormous creatures, and within those bones lay blackened cargoes that explained the blaze better than any rumour ever could. Tar turned to rivers, sugar to caramel, hemp to ropes of smoke, timber to a vocabulary of sparks. The ledger of causes was handwritten in substance rather than malice. From the Guildhall ruins workers lifted a scorched ceremonial staff, wood charred yet still straight, the gilding dimmed but present, and a clerk held it as a compass while surveyors marked new widths for streets, the past quite literally guiding the measure of tomorrow. Children searching for souvenirs found melted pewter shaped like small ponds, and a boy carried one to his mother as if presenting a lake in his palms, saying it was heavy with yesterday. She set it beside their tent peg like a paperweight for memory. Not every discovery was tender. In a collapsed granary, heat had brewed a sour perfume that made men gag, and in a chandlery the wax had poured down into a stone basin, a pale lake that would need to be chiselled out in patient chips, a reminder that reconstruction would be labour before it became vision. As the sun leaned low, the rubble gave a final whisper, a glint from a cracked mirror that showed your ash-streaked face beside shattered rafters, and you felt the central mystery deepen, that cities are palimpsests, and beneath one London another waits, offering lessons in space, materials, and mercy for any who will dig with both tools and conscience. Out of the ash fields, London unrolled a new blueprint, not in ink alone, but in breath, oath, and memory, and you stood at the tables where surveyors pinned ribbons across charcoaled maps, widening lanes in the mind before chisels touched stone, imagining sight lines where wind lost appetite and flame met refusal. Names long tied to trade returned with rulers, proposing squares that breathed, quays that organised cargo, markets that no longer smouldered like kitchens, and avenues broad enough for carts, engines, and escape. A choreography of movement meant to turn panic into orderly flow and memory into measured streets. Architects sketched London history as rebirth, and among them rose a calm voice speaking of stone and proportion, the mind you know as Christopher Wren, tracing graceful axes from river to hill, setting churches as constellations for community, promising that resilience could be drawn, lifted, and lived within everyday light. Merchants, guilds, and masons gathered at trestles to argue frontage and cost. Yet beneath the bargaining you heard a deeper treaty forming, that the rebuilt city would protect the poor as well as the powerful, by spacing homes, separating fuel from hearth, lowering risk where narrow lanes once multiplied hazard. Along the river, planners redrew quays so cargoes of timber, oil, sugar and spice would rest in disciplined districts, with fire-break yards like quiet parks and sluices arranged for speed, turning the Thames from witness into instrument, a living artery of safety, commerce and evacuation when danger returned. In the camps, people rehearsed tomorrow by building orderly lanes between tents, naming pathways after lost parishes, and their feet taught the surveyors what the ink sometimes forgot, that human habit favours curves, meeting points, and shade, and that a humane city listens to footsteps before dictating distances. You watched apprentices raise trial walls of brick, each course a steady drumbeat, and elders blessed the plumb lines with simple nods, for the lesson of the Great Fire of London had entered bone and custom. Build in materials that slow disaster, widen streets so wind disperses, teach children why spacing saves lives. Pamphlets fluttered like migrating birds, explaining insurance charters, shared pumps, parish brigades, and drills, and even the most stubborn traditionalists softened when shown how contributions would purchase readiness, not fear, because security is a marketplace where every citizen buys a little piece through patience, cooperation, and the daily maintenance of shared tools. Amid the measuring and the meetings, memory remained present, stitched into the plans as chapels, gardens, and stones engraved with former street names, so that the new city would carry the old like a heartbeat under a renewed ribcage, honouring loss while refusing to rebuild the corridors that betrayed breath. When evening settled, the survey flags stirred like small flames that could not harm, and you felt hope walk the cleared avenues, certain that a safer London history was not possible but near, for imagination had become architecture, and architecture would become shelter, livelihood, belonging, and an oath kept. In the charred silence after fire's retreat, London began the birth of modern fire safety. Not with fanfare, but with weary hands drafting laws, scribes recording promises, and citizens insisting that such ruin must never again devour streets so swiftly. You hear the debates as aldermen and masons measure not just stone, but policy, speaking of fire brigades formed by oath, of water engines stationed at parish lines, of hooks and buckets drilled in every ward until discipline becomes as natural as breath. From the camps where hunger still claws, people listen to pamphlets read aloud, explaining that insurance companies will rise, offering protection in coin and contract, creating a new market where loss becomes risk shared, not burden borne alone. It is here that the first true brigades are imagined, men sworn to readiness, ladders and axes stacked in ordered houses, bells tested weekly, uniforms cut to mark duty from panic. The Great Fire of London teaches that architecture alone cannot protect, that law must be scaffold as strong as brick, and so proclamations ban timber facades, mandate wider streets, require walls of stone and roofs of tile, changes etched into royal decree but hammered home by communal fear. You see apprentices practicing with pumps, water arcing in rehearsal as neighbours cheer, proof that vigilance has become entertainment, spectacle turned lesson. Landlords grumble at expense, yet insurance assessors carry quills like swords, marking premiums higher for those who build in reckless ways, and thus money itself becomes a silent guard against negligence. In parishes, watchmen adopt new rotations, bells designated for alarm not market, and children are taught the meaning of drills, their small hands passing buckets in play that rehearses tomorrow's defence. The city breathes in new rhythm, each cough of dust replaced by the steady pulse of preparation, and though resentment lingers at cost and inconvenience, beneath it grows agreement that resilience is cheaper than catastrophe, that foresight is mercy written into stone and practice alike. Fires still flicker in hearths and forges, but they now burn within walls measured by law, overseen by surveyors, and imagined not as destiny but as risk that can be managed. From these measures grows a culture, a vigilance that echoes across centuries, inspiring other cities to copy, to legislate, to drill, until the phrase "Great Fire" becomes not prophecy but cautionary tale whispered beside pump and ledger. The blaze that once consumed 13,000 homes, 80 parish churches and countless livelihoods now births an architecture of safety, discipline, and shared responsibility that will guard generations unborn. You walk past a brigade house rising in brick, hear axes thudding in training, and understand the paradox. Destruction has sown prevention, ruin has fathered reform, and from smoke has risen a city not only rebuilt but armed with knowledge, vigilance, and the first heartbeat of modern fire safety. When the flames finally bowed to emptiness and stone, the true endurance of the Great Fire of London began not in smoke, but in memory, for people carried the Inferno inside them like a second heartbeat, retelling its roar in markets, writing its heat into diaries, painting its shadows onto canvases, and singing its lessons in psalms beneath tents. Samuel Pepys dipped quill into ink still scented with soot, capturing the crack of collapsing beams, the taste of ash on bread, the terror of St. Paul's Cathedral crumbling, and his words would echo long after ruins were rebuilt, ensuring that future Londoners could walk through fire without flame. Artists traced the skyline with scars, sketching silhouettes of towers bent by smoke. Their drawings not only recording disaster, but shaping imagination, so that even those who had never seen the blaze could feel its fever in every crooked line. Folklore grew in taverns and alleys, whispering of sparks guided by invisible hands, of angels seen in the smoke, of devils laughing from rafters, stories less concerned with truth than with giving fear a face. Yet even those myths served memory, binding the city in shared language of survival and fate. Children born in camps played at rebuilding, stacking stones and sticks into miniature Londons, while elders narrated what once stood, so that loss became curriculum, a living syllabus written in ash and passed through play. Preachers invoked the Inferno as warning and promise, telling congregations that fire was judgment but also renewal, weaving theology into the architecture of recovery so that each brick laid in stone carried not only weight but meaning. In broadsheets and pamphlets, the catastrophe became a moral allegory, warning of sin, praising resilience, instructing readers that destiny had struck but also spared, a paradox London would live with forever. You watched as merchants marked anniversaries, opening ledgers with black borders on the date when their warehouses fell, not only to mourn but to remind apprentices that vigilance is the twin of prosperity. Sculptors carved fragments of charred timber into small crosses, worn around necks as talismans against recurrence, while households placed melted coins on mantelpieces, grim relics that told visitors, "We survived." In memory, the fire became larger than its footprint, sprawling across poems, sermons, and songs, until it was less an event than an element, as much a part of London's identity as the Thames itself. Yet memory does more than preserve. It edits, and you saw how stories shifted over decades, exaggerating heroism, erasing panic, polishing ruin into resilience, until the Great Fire of London was remembered not as a wound but as a forge, the place where a medieval city of timber gave birth to a capital of stone and destiny. That transformation, told and retold, ensured that the fire never died, because as long as its memory burned, it guided laws, sharpened architecture, and whispered caution every time wood and wind met in narrow lanes. Beyond London's scorched map the echoes carried, and you begin to hear how empires far from the Thames leaned close to the Great Fire of London, as if to study a tutor carved in flame. For Amsterdam merchants compared their brick quays and wide canals with the narrow timbered lanes that had betrayed their English rivals, boasting yet also adjusting patrols and storage laws, while in Paris planners whispered of boulevards broad enough to suffocate sparks, a vision later sharpened by kings who saw in London's fate a rehearsal for their own urban survival. Across the Atlantic in Boston, colonial officials read reports of 4 days of hell with trembling pens, sketching ordinances that demanded firehooks and ladders be kept in every ward, imagining their wooden port city lit by the same cruel wind, and in New Amsterdam, soon to be New York, merchants posted broadsheets that turned London's ruin into a warning bell rung across the ocean. Even further, in the ports of the Caribbean, where sugar warehouses stood stacked like powder magazines, overseers demanded stone walls and firebreak yards, knowing that the loss of London trade could unbalance islands already fragile with storms, drought and hunger. There, the Great Fire of London became not only a European memory, but a colonial cautionary tale stitched into plantation rules, when, centuries later, flames would engulf Chicago. Newspapers reached back to London, drawing parallels between timber, wind, and destiny, as if the 17th century blaze had cast a shadow long enough to touch the 19th. The Ottoman scribes noted the English disaster in court bulletins, placing it beside accounts of Constantinople's own fires, recording how cities tied to trade are also tied to flame, each Inferno a chapter in a global manual of urban risk. You realise that London's blaze became a mirror in which other cities glimpsed their vulnerabilities, an uninvited ambassador that travelled farther than any merchant fleet, delivering lessons in spacing, materials and vigilance. Insurance companies rose in its aftermath, and their pamphlets crossed borders too, teaching that catastrophe could be calculated, managed and even profited upon, spreading the paradox that out of ash grows not only resilience but commerce. Soldiers in fortresses discussed how firebombs might do to enemy cities what wind and negligence had done to London, transforming tragedy into tactical thought, so that the blaze's ghost stood in war councils as well as parish halls. Everywhere, the Great Fire of London became more than a local scar. It was a cosmic parable of fragility and renewal, teaching empires that cities are not eternal, but provisional, and that destiny demands vigilance as much as ambition. And as centuries advanced, the echo did not fade. It became embedded in building codes, in insurance clauses, in the muscle memory of firefighters across continents, a lasting testament that London's trial by fire had become the world's inheritance, a universal reminder that wood, wind and want can conspire anywhere, and that wisdom lies in preparing before the spark arrives. Beneath the soot and rubble, Londoners began to see not only wreckage but a pattern, and the hidden symbolism of the Great Fire of London pressed itself into sermons, diaries, and whispered conversations, shaping the catastrophe into a parable where the city became both sinner and saint, punished and purified in the same consuming breath. Preachers declared that the blaze was divine retribution for vanity, greed, and secret sins, pointing to melted chalices and fallen steeples as proof that heaven had tilted its lamp in judgment. Yet in the same sentences they promised rebirth, claiming that the ashes were seedbeds from which righteousness and strength would rise. Pamphleteers drew parallels to biblical floods and plagues, arguing that just as water cleansed, so too did flame, and that London's destiny had been rewritten in fire ink upon stone parchment. Others saw numerological omen in the year 1666, whispering that the mark of the beast had manifested in timber and pitch, and that the Inferno was not only accident but apocalypse, a prophecy fulfilled in smoke. You heard mothers hush children with tales that devils had danced on Pudding Lane, and that angels had carried survivors through firebreak gaps, myth-wrapping trauma until it could be endured. Among scholars, the symbolism became more subtle. The fire represented the end of medieval confinement, the torching of superstition, the clearing of space for reason, enlightenment, and empire, so that ruin itself could be interpreted as the will of progress disguised in flame. In taverns, sailors spoke of London as a phoenix city, a bird that must burn to rise again, and that image took root, painted onto signs and stitched into badges, until even those who lost everything could comfort themselves with the vision of rebirth. Hidden in all these symbols was a collective refusal to see the fire as meaningless chaos. To assign it shape and destiny was to reclaim control, to imagine that suffering was not wasted but woven into a larger design. In this symbolism the city learned resilience, for when catastrophe is seen as punishment alone it crushes, but when it is seen as trial or transformation, it steels resolve. You trace how this narrative spread beyond pulpits, shaping policies and laws, as leaders proclaimed that rebuilding in stone was not only prudent but moral, a visible sign of repentance and responsibility. The hidden symbolism became architecture, became insurance contracts, became fire brigades, became the very heartbeat of modern London, so that centuries later, when people gaze at Wren's dome rising over the Thames, they are not only seeing stone but also the memory of judgment and rebirth crystallized into skyline. To walk those streets is to tread upon metaphors turned cobblestone, where every widened lane and every brick wall carries the echo of sermons that told a frightened city its suffering had meaning. Thus the great fire of London became more than disaster. It became scripture of destiny, teaching generations that destruction can be read as revelation, and that from burning pasts new empires may be written. From Inferno to Empire, the arc of London bends across centuries, and you feel how the Great Fire of London, though born in terror and despair, became the furnace in which an imperial city was forged, its timber past burned away to reveal a new skeleton of stone, steel, and vision, and its people tempered like iron hammered by fate. Out of the rubble came avenues broad enough for processions, quays deep enough for fleets, and buildings resilient enough to guard treasure, law, and memory. The skyline grew taller and more disciplined, crowned by Wren's dome, a monument that stood not only as a cathedral, but as a declaration that faith, science, and endurance could share one roof. Insurance companies and fire brigades, both children of the Inferno, hardened civic life with practical vigilance, teaching that collective responsibility was as essential as royal command, while guilds and merchants learned that prosperity demanded planning, not merely fortune. The lessons of spacing, of brick, of fire breaks became so deeply ingrained that they travelled with colonists, appearing in Boston ordinances, in Caribbean warehouses, and eventually in the industrial cities that powered global trade, meaning that London's suffering had authored a manual for empire. Yet the fire's true legacy was not only structural but psychological. Londoners absorbed the paradox that destruction can be destiny, that catastrophe can crown ambition, and this belief girded them as they later endured plague, war and bombardment, always carrying in their marrow the knowledge that ash can be a beginning. Artists, diarists and preachers continued to shape the memory, recasting the Inferno as trial by fire, through which the city proved itself chosen, cleansed and prepared to command seas and colonies. In taverns, sailors lifted mugs to the phoenix, while in courts, officials cited the fire as the moment when London stepped from medieval parochialism into modern grandeur. The empire that followed, its ships sailing to Asia, Africa and the Americas, its merchants binding markets across oceans, bore within it the unspoken confidence that the worst had already been endured at home, and that from smoke and sorrow a global destiny had been lit. You can walk today along those widened lanes, look up at brick facades layered with centuries, and still hear the echo of that fire, a whisper that cities must be remade to survive, a reminder that every empire is built not only on conquest, but also on resilience born from ruin. From Pudding Lane's forgotten spark to the empire's towering might, the continuum is clear. The Great Fire of London was not merely an ending, but a beginning, a crucible in which stone, policy and imagination conspired to transform a medieval capital into the beating heart of a world-spanning power. And so, the city that once lay choking in smoke rose not only rebuilt but reborn, carrying with it the conviction that from your ashes come empires, and that destiny, however cruel its torch, can also illuminate paths of greatness. The Great Fire of London was more than a disaster. It was the turning point that transformed a wooden medieval city into the stone capital of an empire. From Pudding Lane's spark to St. Paul's collapse, every flame carried the weight of destiny. In its ashes rose modern fire safety, new architecture, and the foundations of global London. The Inferno did not merely consume, it recreated. History reminds us that even the fiercest catastrophe can forge resilience, innovation, and rebirth. And the question lingers: what unseen fires still shape the cities of our future?